A woman can survive hunger, cold, and humiliation, but the cruelest winter is the one that convinces her she has nowhere left to go. Miss Evelyn Carter stood on the front steps of Whitemore Parish School with the rain turning to sleet around her, her small leather valise in one hand and the torn remains of her letter of recommendation in the other. Behind her, the schoolhouse windows glowed with the yellow warmth of lamps she would never light again, while beyond the iron gate the narrow road curved down toward the harbor, where the Atlantic beat against the docks with a sound like distant thunder. She had been dismissed at 4 o'clock, just as the December sky began to darken, because she had done the unforgivable thing. She had defended a poor fisherman's son when the child of a wealthy trustee mocked his coat, shoved his books into the mud, and laughed as if poverty were a stain that could never be washed clean. Evelyn had not shouted. She had not wept. She had merely placed herself between the boys and said, in a voice steady enough to shame the room, that cruelty was not privilege, and money did not make a gentleman. By 5 o'clock, the headmaster had called her conduct unsuitable. By 5:30, her small desk had been emptied. By 6, she was walking alone through the storm with $11 in her purse, 2 schoolbooks wrapped in cloth, and no family within 300 miles who would open a door to her. The wind came off Stormhaven cliffs with needles of ice hidden inside it. It lifted the hem of her dark wool dress and pressed cold through the seams of her coat, but Evelyn kept her chin raised as she passed the last shops of Whitemore. The baker's wife saw her and looked away. The postmaster pretended to sort letters. In a town so small that every bell was heard by every household, disgrace traveled faster than weather. She could feel it moving ahead of her, knocking on doors before she did. No respectable boarding house would want a dismissed schoolteacher under its roof. No mother would entrust her daughters to a woman accused of insolence toward her betters. Still, she walked. 1 step. Then another. Pride was not warmth, but it was the last garment she owned that had not been taken from her. The road climbed past the closed chapel, then the old cemetery, where the headstones leaned beneath a skin of frozen rain. Evelyn paused only when her breath came sharp and thin, her gloved fingers numb around the handle of the valise. A child's primer slipped from beneath the cloth bundle and fell open in the mud. She knelt to retrieve it, and for one unbearable moment, the sight of the little inked letters blurred before her eyes. Not because she had lost a position. Positions could be replaced. But because she had lost the one place where her gentleness had seemed useful, where lonely children had looked at her as if kindness were a lesson worth learning. She pressed the book to her chest and rose too quickly. The world tilted. The black iron fence of the cemetery bent toward her like a shadow. She reached for it, missed, and would have fallen into the road had the sudden snort of horses not pulled her back to herself. A carriage had stopped a few yards away, black as wet coal, its lanterns burning through the sleet. The crest on the door was silver, a hawk above a broken crown. Everyone in Whitemore knew that crest, though few had seen it so near. Ashbourne. The richest house on the cliffs. The house with shuttered windows, silent children, and a duke who had not hosted a dinner since his wife was carried to the family vault 4 winters earlier. The carriage door opened. A man stepped down without haste, tall beneath a dark overcoat, his face cut by lamplight and rain. Duke Callum Ashbourne did not look like a rescuer. He looked like judgment carved from stone. His gray eyes moved from Evelyn's soaked bonnet to the book clutched against her heart, then to the torn letter in her trembling hand. For several seconds he said nothing at all. The storm filled the silence between them. Evelyn tried to curtsy, but her knees weakened, and she caught the fence again. "Forgive me, Your Grace," she said, her voice thin but controlled. "I did not mean to delay your road." His gaze lowered to the fallen scraps of paper at her feet. One piece had turned face up in the mud, showing the words no longer suitable for instruction. Something passed across his expression, not softness, not yet, but recognition sharpened by old pain. "Were you dismissed?" he asked. "For harming a child or protecting one?" Evelyn lifted her eyes to his. The answer cost her less than the silence would have. "For protecting one." The Duke's gloved hand tightened once at his side. Then, from inside the carriage, A small pale face appeared behind the fogged glass, watching Evelyn with solemn curiosity. A boy. No more than 8. Behind him, another smaller shadow shifted and vanished. Callum saw her notice them, and a flicker of guarded weariness crossed his face, as if the sight of his own sons was both duty and wound. "Miss Carter," he said, though she had never given him her name. "You are wet through, half frozen, and walking toward a town that has already decided what it thinks of you." Evelyn swallowed. "Then I shall keep walking until I find a kinder one." For the first time, the Duke looked fully at her, not at her ruined coat, not at her poverty, but at the dignity still standing upright inside the storm. "Kind towns are rare," he said. "Shelter is rarer." The carriage lantern trembled in the wind. The older boy's hand pressed against the window, small and white against the glass. Evelyn saw it before the Duke turned away. She saw, too, the way his shoulders stiffened, as if a father could be rich enough to own every mile of coastline and still not know how to cross the distance to his own child. Callum opened the carriage door wider. "Come," he said. "Ashbourne Hall is 3 miles from here. No one should be left on this road tonight." Evelyn hesitated at the edge of the step. To enter that carriage was to enter the unknown, and yet the night behind her held no mercy, only sleet, whispers, and locked doors. She gathered her valise, her books, and the last of her composure. Then she stepped into the shadowed warmth, unaware that the house waiting on the cliffs did not need a teacher nearly as much as it needed someone brave enough to wake the deadened hearts inside it. The carriage moved north along the cliff road, its wheels cutting through slush while the sea roared unseen below, and Evelyn Carter sat with her wet gloves folded in her lap as if still seated before a schoolroom desk instead of inside the private carriage of the most feared man in Wigmore County. Across from her, Duke Callum Ashbourne remained silent, his profile carved by the lantern glow, his dark hair damp at the temples, his eyes fixed not on her but on the storm beyond the glass. The 2 boys sat beside him. The elder, Oliver, watched Evelyn with solemn grey eyes far too old for his narrow face. The younger, Samuel, leaned against his brother with a wool scarf pulled up to his chin, one hand hidden inside his coat as if holding something precious. Neither child spoke. Their silence did not feel like shyness. It felt practiced. Protected. The kind of silence children learned when a house had taught them that grief was louder than any question they might ask. Evelyn warmed her fingers against the small breath of heat rising from the carriage foot warmer, and resisted the urge to fill the quiet with polite words. A teacher learned early that not every child wished to be reached directly. Some had to be approached like frightened birds, with stillness, patience, and no sudden hunger to be trusted. After nearly 20 minutes, the carriage climbed a steeper road, and Ashbourne Hall appeared through the sleet. It stood on the edge of Stormhaven cliffs like a great grey ship run aground above the Atlantic, all steep roofs, narrow windows, and chimneys breathing pale smoke into the winter dark. Its eastern tower rose against the clouds, and beyond it, on a distant ridge, the abandoned lighthouse flashed no beam, only a black shape against a blacker sea. Evelyn had heard stories of the house, of course. Every town had stories for the places its people feared to enter. They said the curtains had been drawn for 4 years. They said the ballroom was kept locked. They said the Duchess's portrait still hung veiled in the entrance hall, and that the Duke crossed the corridor each night without looking at it. The carriage stopped beneath a stone archway. Before the footman could open the door, Callum stepped down and turned back, offering Evelyn his hand with formality rather than tenderness. His palm was steady. Hers was cold enough to tremble. "You will be given a room for the night," he said. "Dry clothing will be sent up. Mrs. Vale, the housekeeper, will see that you have supper. Your Grace, I cannot impose beyond tonight." "You can," he answered, and there was no warmth in the words, only command shaped by habit. Inside, Ashbourne Hall smelled of beeswax, old wood, and rain carried in on wool. The entrance hall soared above them, shadowed by dark beams and lined with portraits whose painted eyes seemed to follow every movement. At the far wall hung one frame covered in black cloth. Evelyn did not stare, though she felt the boys stiffen when they passed it. Samuel's hidden hand tightened beneath his coat. Oliver looked at the floor. A tall woman in a high-collared black dress came forward with a candle. "Mrs. Vale," the Duke said. "Miss Carter was caught in the storm. Prepare the blue guest room." The housekeeper's eyes flickered once toward Evelyn's muddy hem, then softened almost invisibly. "Of course, Your Grace. And have tea brought to the morning room." Evelyn turned. "Please do not trouble yourself." Callum removed his gloves finger by finger. "This house has many troubles, Miss Carter. Tea is not one of them." The boys were led away by a maid, though Samuel glanced back once from the stairs. It was not at his father. It was at Evelyn's bundle of books. She noticed. So did the Duke. When they were alone in the morning room, the fire there had been built high, but the space still felt cold, as if warmth had entered only by permission and never been invited to stay. Callum stood by the mantel. Evelyn remained near the chair offered to her, unwilling to sit until he did. "You were a schoolteacher," he said. "I am one still. Without a school, a profession does not vanish because a door closes." His eyes rested on her with the first hint of interest. "Do you always answer ruin with grammar?" "When grammar is all I have left, yes." For a moment, something almost human touched his mouth, then disappeared. He crossed to the window, where sleet struck the glass in silver lines. "My sons have dismissed 6 tutors in 8 months. Oliver refuses instruction from anyone he considers temporary. Samuel wakes most nights and cannot be comforted by servants. Their aunt believes they should be sent away to be made stronger. I disagree." Evelyn's heart tightened, though her voice remained careful. Children are not strengthened by being exiled from their own sorrow. Callum turned then fully. The fire threw light along one side of his face and left the other in shadow. "You speak as if you know sorrow well." "I know children better." "Good." He took a sealed envelope from the desk and placed it between them. "Stay for 30 days. Teach them. Watch them. Give them order where I have failed to give them peace. You will receive wages, references, and protection from whatever gossip Whitemore chooses to invent." Evelyn looked at the envelope but did not touch it. "And what would I be to them?" He did not answer quickly. In the silence, the house seemed to listen. "Whatever they need you to be." Evelyn lifted her chin. "That is too much power to give a stranger." "It is not power I am giving you, Miss Carter. It is desperation." The word fell softly, but it changed the air. For the first time since she had entered his carriage, Evelyn saw not the wealthy Duke, not the stone-faced widower, but a father standing in a beautiful house he could not mend. Before she could speak, a small sound came from the doorway. Samuel stood there in his nightshirt, pale and barefoot, clutching a woman's embroidered handkerchief. His eyes were fixed on the book in Evelyn's bundle. "You have the harbor mice," he whispered. Mrs. Vale gasped faintly behind him, as if the sound of his voice were a dropped crystal. Callum went utterly still. Evelyn knelt, not too close, and drew the little book free. "I do," she said gently. "It is best read beside a fire." Samuel looked at his father, then back at her. "Mamma read that one." The room held its breath. Evelyn did not promise what she could not give. She only opened the book to the first page and said, "Then she had excellent taste." Samuel took one step into the room. Then another. And behind Evelyn, Duke Callum Ashbourne turned his face slightly away, as if the first small sound of his child returning to life had wounded him more deeply than silence ever had. By morning, the storm had passed beyond Stormhaven cliffs, leaving Ashbourne Hall wrapped in a pale coastal fog that pressed against the windows like breath against glass. Evelyn woke before the household bell, uncertain for one suspended moment where she was, until the carved ceiling above her, the heavy blue curtains, and the unfamiliar weight of borrowed wool reminded her that she had slept beneath the roof of a grieving duke. The room given to her was finer than any place she had ever occupied, with a narrow fireplace, a writing desk, and a view of the Atlantic breaking white against the rocks 300 feet below. Yet luxury did not make it welcoming. Every object seemed too still. Every polished surface held the silence of a house that had learned to move without joy. Mrs. Vale arrived with breakfast on a tray and a grey dress altered from some former maid's wardrobe, plain but clean. "His Grace has asked that you join the young gentleman in the old nursery at 9 o'clock, she said. Evelyn thanked her and dressed with care, pinning her chestnut hair at the nape of her neck, smoothing the sleeves as though neatness could serve as armor. When she stepped into the corridor, Ashbourne Hall revealed itself by degrees. It was not merely large. It was watchful. The west wing smelled faintly of lemon oil and cold stone. The stair rail was black walnut, worn smooth by generations of hands. Along the upper hall, portraits of stern Ashbourne ancestors stared down from gilded frames, their pale faces suspended in candle-colored gloom. At the end of one passage, Evelyn passed a locked door. A child's height marks had once been scratched into the frame, then abandoned. Beside it hung a small brass key on a ribbon, but the ribbon was coated in dust. She paused only a second. A house always confessed what its owners could not. The old nursery faced east, toward the sea. It contained shelves of untouched toys, maps of the United States and the world, a globe with a crack across the Atlantic, and 2 desks placed too far apart for brothers. Oliver sat at the left one, already dressed, his slate before him, his posture perfect. Samuel sat on the window seat with the handkerchief in his lap, his bare heels tucked beneath him despite the chill. Duke Callum Ashbourne stood near the mantel, as if he had come to deliver prisoners rather than children. "Miss Carter will conduct lessons for 1 month," he said. "You will show her respect." Oliver's eyes did not move from Evelyn. "Will she leave after that?" The question struck the room more sharply because it came from a child who rarely spoke. Callum's jaw tightened. "That depends." "It always depends," Oliver said softly. Samuel looked down at the handkerchief. Evelyn understood then that 6 tutors had not been dismissed by mischief alone. They had been tested and found temporary. She set her books on the table, removed her gloves, and spoke not to the Duke but to the boys. "I will not ask either of you to trust me today. Trust is not homework. It cannot be assigned by 9 o'clock and inspected by noon." Samuel glanced up. Oliver frowned, perhaps suspicious of kindness that did not demand gratitude. "Then what will you teach?" he asked. Evelyn opened her bundle and placed the harbor mice on the table, then beside it a grammar primer, a small atlas, and a folded sheet of drawing paper. "First, I will learn what you already know. Then I will learn what you are afraid to know. After that, we shall decide where to begin." Callum's expression shifted, but he said nothing. He remained only long enough to watch Samuel slide from the window seat and come one careful step nearer the book. Then the Duke turned toward the door. Samuel's small voice stopped him. "Are you staying, father?" The word father seemed to travel through Callum like a blade made of memory, though his face did not break. "I have estate matters." "You always do," Oliver said. Evelyn lowered her eyes to the desk, giving the wound privacy. Callum left without answering, and the door closed with a quiet final sound that changed the temperature of the room. For the next hour, Evelyn did not force lessons into order. She asked Oliver to mark the safest route from Whitemore Harbor to Boston on the map, and though he pretended indifference, he chose the path with careful intelligence. She asked Samuel to count the mice hidden in the book illustrations, and he whispered each number as if words were fragile things that might shatter if spoken too loudly. By noon, she had learned that Oliver loved ships but hated departures, that Samuel could read better than anyone knew, and that both boys looked toward the door whenever footsteps passed, hoping and fearing it would be their father. After luncheon, Evelyn found a vase in a cupboard and placed 3 dried winter roses on the nursery table. Oliver stared at them. "Flowers are not allowed here." "Who said so?" "No one." His mouth tightened. "They just stopped." Evelyn touched one brittle petal. "Then perhaps they may begin again quietly." That evening, as she returned the boys to their rooms, Samuel paused outside her door with the harbor mice held against his chest. "Could you read 1 page?" he asked. "Only 1. Evelyn sat in the hallway because he would not cross the threshold, and she read softly while the gas lamps hummed and the fog pressed white against the windows. Halfway through the third page, Samuel leaned against the doorframe and fell asleep standing. Evelyn caught him gently before he slipped, gathering him in her arms with the careful strength of someone used to carrying burdens no one saw. At the far end of the corridor, Callum stood in shadow, one hand braced against the wall. He had come silently. He had heard every word. But when Evelyn looked up, he did not step forward to take his son. He only stared at the sleeping child with such naked sorrow that she understood the terrible truth of Ashbourne Hall. The children were not the only ones waiting outside a locked room. Their father was there too. By the fourth morning, Ashbourne Hall had not grown warmer, but it had begun to make small sounds of life again. A chair scraped in the nursery before breakfast. A child's footstep hurried once, then stopped, as if ashamed of being eager. The old globe, cracked across the Atlantic, turned beneath Oliver's hand while Samuel sat cross-legged on the rug, sorting seashells Evelyn had asked Mrs. Vale to bring from a cabinet no one had opened in years. Outside, the fog lifted enough to reveal the grey sweep of Stormhaven Bay, where fishing boats moved like dark stitches across the water. Evelyn stood at the long table mending the torn cuff of Oliver's navy coat, her needle flashing in the thin morning light. The coat was outgrown at the wrists and polished at the elbows, but the boy had refused every new garment sent from Boston. "It is too small," Oliver said without looking at her. "I know. Then why fix it?" "Because you still choose it." His fingers paused on the globe. "That is not an answer." Evelyn smiled faintly and tied a knot in the thread. "It is the truest one I have." From the doorway, unseen by the children, Duke Callum Ashbourne had stopped on his way to the library. He had meant only to ask whether the boys required anything from town. Instead, he watched Evelyn turn the worn sleeve inside out and smooth the fabric as if it were something worthy of care. "Children often keep old things," she said, speaking gently enough that Samuel could listen without feeling watched. "Not because the old thing is useful. Sometimes because it remembers a version of life they are afraid no one else remembers." The needle passed through cloth. The room grew still. Samuel's hand closed around the embroidered handkerchief in his lap. Oliver's gaze lowered to the coat. Callum's breath changed in the doorway, almost imperceptibly, but Evelyn heard it. She did not turn. To expose a man's pain too quickly was its own unkindness. After a moment, the Duke entered as if he had just arrived. "Mr. Hart will bring new books from Portland next week," he said. "If there is anything required for lessons, make a list." Evelyn folded the repaired coat. "Thank you, Your Grace. The boys are progressing well." Oliver gave a short, humorless sound. "Progressing means we have not made her leave yet." Callum's eyes moved to his son, but no rebuke came. Perhaps he had begun to understand that children who had lost too much often hid terror inside insolence. "Have you tried?" he asked quietly. Oliver looked startled. Samuel looked up from the rug. Evelyn remained silent, letting father and son stand in the fragile space between question and answer. "Not hard," Oliver said at last. "Why not?" The boy's mouth tightened. "Samuel likes her stories." It was not the whole truth. It was what he could bear to say. Callum accepted it with a slight nod, and for the first time Evelyn saw a father choose not to demand more than a child could give. That afternoon, rain returned, softer than before, whispering against the tall windows while Evelyn moved the lesson to the unused conservatory. The glass roof was clouded, and the plants inside had thinned to dry stems and stubborn ivy, but there was light there. Real light. Samuel traced letters in the dust on a low table. Oliver copied a map of the Maine coastline with careful precision. Evelyn read aloud from a chapter on lighthouses, explaining how a beam could guide ships safely for more than 20 miles when weather allowed. "Then why does ours not work?" Samuel asked. Evelyn glanced toward the black shape beyond the cliffs. "Perhaps no one has lit it in a long time. Father says it is unsafe." Oliver did not lift his head. "Father says many things are unsafe." A shadow passed across the conservatory door. Callum again. This time he did not retreat. "Some things are," he said. Samuel stiffened, but Evelyn only closed the book gently. "And some things become more frightening the longer they remain closed." Callum's gaze met hers across the dim green room. There was warning in it, and something else beneath the warning, something weary and almost pleading. "Miss Carter," he said, "you make a habit of opening doors. Only the ones children keep looking at." The rain tapped the glass. Oliver's pencil stopped. Samuel looked from one adult to the other, sensing that the lesson had changed though no slate had been lifted. Callum turned away first. "The conservatory is cold. Do not keep them here long." But when he left, he did not close the door fully behind him. That evening, after the boys had eaten more than Mrs. Vale had seen in months, Evelyn carried a stack of books toward the nursery and found Oliver alone in the upper hall. He stood before the locked room with the dusty key hanging beside it, his hand hovering just below the brass knob. "That was our schoolroom," he said. His voice had lost its sharpness. "Before." Evelyn stopped several feet away. "Before your mother died?" He nodded once. "Samuel thinks if it opens, she will be gone forever." "And what do you think?" Oliver's shoulders rose and fell. For a moment he was only 8 years old, too proud to cry and too tired to keep pretending pride was enough. "I think Father does not look at us because we remind him she is gone." The words were quiet. They were also devastating. Behind the bend in the corridor, Callum stood unseen, one hand closed around the banister so tightly his knuckles had gone pale. Evelyn felt his presence, felt the ache of it, but kept her eyes on the child. "Sometimes grown people grieve so clumsily that they make children believe they are the wound," she said. "But you are not the wound, Oliver. Neither is Samuel." Oliver swallowed. "Then why does he not come in?" Evelyn's answer came softly. "Perhaps he is afraid you will see how broken he is." The hall held its breath. Oliver looked at the closed door, then at Evelyn. "Are fathers allowed to be broken?" "Yes," she said. "But they are not allowed to leave their children alone inside the pieces." Far behind them, a floorboard whispered. Callum had stepped back into shadow. He did not enter. Not yet. But that night, long after the lamps were lowered and the sea beat steadily below the cliffs, he stood outside his son's bedroom with his hand raised to knock. For nearly 1 full minute, Duke Callum Ashbourne remained there, fighting an enemy no one else could see. Then his hand lowered. The knock never came. Inside the room, Oliver lay awake listening. Outside the room, his father bowed his head in silence. And between them, Ashbourne Hall waited for one of its locked doors to open. Lady Beatrice Wainwright arrived at Ashbourne Hall on a Thursday afternoon, when the rain had turned the cliff road silver, and the sea below Stormhaven was restless enough to strike the rocks like a warning. Her carriage was white with polished brass lamps, too bright against the grey house, and it stopped beneath the stone arch as if it had come not to visit but to inspect. Evelyn saw it from the conservatory, where Samuel was pressing dried ivy between sheets of paper and Oliver was copying a line from his geography book with more care than he wished anyone to notice. The boys changed before the footman announced the visitor. Samuel's shoulders lifted toward his ears. Oliver set down his pencil and looked toward the door with the expression of a child preparing to endure something familiar. "Aunt Beatrice," he said. Samuel closed the book at once, hiding the ivy inside as if tenderness itself might be confiscated. Evelyn understood before she saw the woman. Some people entered a house like weather. Others entered like judgment. Lady Beatrice did both. She swept into the morning room an hour later in dove-colored silk, her blonde hair arranged beneath a feathered hat, her gloves so pale they made everything they touched seem unclean by comparison. She kissed neither child. She offered her cheek to Callum and gave Evelyn a glance that measured her dress, her hands, and her place in the room with one cold movement. "So this is the new schoolteacher," she said. "Miss Evelyn Carter," Callum replied. "She has been assisting the boys with their lessons." "Assisting," Beatrice repeated, as though the word amused her. "How practical!" Evelyn curtsied. Lady Beatrice. You know my name. How efficient. The smile that followed was beautiful and empty. I suppose efficiency is essential when one must rise by usefulness rather than birth. The room tightened. Oliver looked down. Samuel's fingers found the edge of his mother's handkerchief. Callum's face hardened, but he said only, Miss Carter is a guest under my roof. Beatrice turned to him with a softness that did not reach her eyes. My dear Callum, that is precisely what concerns me. Houses such as this are not merely roofs. They are legacies. Children learn from the company allowed near them. Evelyn felt the insult land, but she did not bend beneath it. She had stood before trustees, mothers with pursed mouths, and men who mistook wealth for virtue. Pride, when stripped of comfort, became very quiet. Then I hope they learn courtesy, she said. Beatrice's gaze sharpened. For one brief second, the silk and perfume vanished, revealing the iron beneath. How spirited! Callum looked at Evelyn then, and something like reluctant admiration moved behind his gray eyes. But he still did not speak enough. Not enough to shield her. Not enough to make the room safe. The silence cut more deeply than Beatrice's words because Evelyn had not expected kindness from the woman, but some small, foolish part of her had hoped for courage from him. After luncheon, Beatrice requested time with the boys and dismissed Evelyn as one might dismiss a maid who had lingered too close to family conversation. Evelyn went to the library to gather readers for the next day, but the shelves there were tall, and the walls carried sound. She did not mean to listen. She only froze when she heard Beatrice's voice from the adjoining parlor. Those children are growing attached to her, Callum answered low. They are improving. They are confusing dependence with affection. A penniless schoolteacher with no family and a damaged reputation cannot be allowed to become necessary. There was a pause. What damaged reputation? Evelyn's hand stilled on the spine of a book. Paper whispered in the next room. Beatrice had brought proof. Dismissed from Whitemore Parish School for improper conduct toward the son of a trustee. I made inquiries in town. Did she not tell you? Callum said nothing for several seconds. Evelyn closed her eyes. Not in shame. In weariness. Truth was a fragile thing in the mouths of those who wished to use it as a weapon. She told me enough, he said at last. Did she? Or did she present herself as a noble martyr because she saw an opportunity in your loneliness? His answer did not come quickly enough. That was the wound. Not that he believed Beatrice. Evelyn did not think he did. But hesitation had its own cruelty. She stepped away from the shelf before she heard more, carrying the books against her chest as if they could keep her upright. In the corridor outside the nursery, she found Samuel sitting on the floor, his knees drawn up, his small face pale. Miss Carter, he whispered, is Aunt Beatrice going to send us away? Evelyn lowered herself beside him, leaving enough space for him to choose closeness or distance. No one has told me that. She says Father cannot raise us in a house full of ghosts. Evelyn looked toward the long hall, where the covered portrait hung at the far end like a darkened window. Ghosts are not always people who have died, she said softly. Sometimes they are words no one has been brave enough to speak. Samuel considered this with grave seriousness. Then he leaned, just slightly, until his shoulder touched her sleeve. That small trust nearly broke her heart. In the afternoon, Beatrice entered the nursery without knocking and found Evelyn reading to both boys beside the fire. Oliver sat at his desk pretending not to listen, though he had turned the page every time she did. Samuel rested against the rug with his chin in his hands. The scene was too gentle for a woman who had built her authority from coldness. How charming, Beatrice said. A little schoolroom fantasy. Oliver stood. We are in a lesson. You are in danger of forgetting who you are. Her eyes moved to Samuel. Your mother was a duchess. Do not replace her with the first woman who offers stories. Samuel went white. Evelyn rose slowly. Lady Beatrice, he is 6 years old. Exactly. Old enough to be guided before sentiment ruins him. Evelyn's voice remained calm, but every word held. A child is not ruined by kindness. Beatrice stepped closer. And a household is not saved by a woman who lost her own position through arrogance. The fire snapped. Oliver stared at Evelyn. Samuel's eyes filled, though no tears fell. Evelyn felt the old humiliation rise, but she met it standing. I lost my position because I protected a child who had no one else in the room willing to do it. If the choice were placed before me again, I would lose it again. From the doorway, Callum had returned. This time he had heard every word. The room waited for him. Beatrice's chin lifted, confident in blood, history, and all the invisible privileges that had always answered when she called. Evelyn did not look at him. She could not bear to ask with her eyes for what should have been freely given. Callum's gaze moved from Samuel's trembling hand to Oliver's rigid face, then to Evelyn, who stood in a plain grey dress with nothing in the world but dignity. Lady Beatrice, he said quietly, you will not speak to Miss Carter that way in my house. It was not a declaration of love. It was not enough to undo the earlier silence. But it was a door opening an inch. Beatrice's smile thinned. Your house, she said? Yes. I see that you are beginning to forget what my sister left behind. The words struck Callum where she intended them to. Evelyn saw him flinch without moving. Beatrice turned and left the nursery in a sweep of silk, carrying the promise of further harm behind her. That night, long after the boys slept uneasily and the rain returned to the windows, Evelyn found the torn dismissal letter folded on the table outside her door. Beside it lay a note in Callum's hand, simple and severe. I should have spoken sooner. She read it once. Then again. The apology was small. The danger was not. Somewhere below, a door closed softly, and from the east wing came the faint sound of the old clock stopping, as it always did, at 2:17. The storm that returned after midnight did not announce itself with thunder. It came first as a tremor in the windows, then as a long moan beneath the eaves, then as rain striking Ashbourne Hall so sharply that every pane seemed to shiver in its frame. Evelyn woke in the blue guest room with the old clock's silence still pressing through the walls. 2:17. The hour the house refused to pass. She sat upright, listening. At first, there was only the Atlantic below the cliffs, violent and unseen, and the wind dragging itself along the stone like a grieving hand. Then came a sound from the corridor. Not a servant's step. Not the Duke's measured tread. Something smaller. Uneven. Evelyn rose at once, pulling her shawl around her shoulders. When she opened her door, the hallway lay dim beneath the gas lamps, and at the far end she saw Oliver standing barefoot outside Samuel's room, his face drained of color. He is gone, Oliver whispered. The words were so quiet that for one terrible second they seemed unreal. Evelyn crossed the corridor. Samuel's bed was empty. The coverlet had been pushed aside, and the embroidered handkerchief was missing from the pillow. Near the open window, rain had dotted the floorboards. Evelyn's heart tightened, but her voice stayed calm because panic was a luxury children could not be asked to carry. When did you notice? I heard him crying. Then I heard the latch. Oliver swallowed hard. Aunt Beatrice told him yesterday that Mama was waiting near the sea. She said if he listened hard enough, he would hear what he had taken from us. Evelyn closed her eyes for one breath. No anger now. Anger would come later, when a child was safe. Wake your father, she said. Tell him the lighthouse. Oliver turned and ran. Evelyn did not wait for a coat. She took the lantern from the hall table, lifted her skirt above her ankles, and descended the back stairs into the storm. The kitchen door opened against a wall of rain. Cold struck her face, stole her breath, and soaked her shawl before she had crossed the terrace. Beyond the gardens, the path to the old lighthouse twisted down toward the ridge, narrow and slick, bordered by winter grass flattened silver beneath the wind. The lantern flame bucked and shuddered in its glass. Evelyn held it close and moved forward, one careful step after another, calling Samuel's name into the storm. The answer came not as a voice, but as a faint pale shape near the lower path. A child's nightshirt. Samuel was ahead of her, small against the darkness, climbing toward the abandoned lighthouse with the handkerchief clutched against his chest. "Samuel!" she called gently, forcing her voice not to sound afraid. He turned once, his face wet with rain and tears, though from a distance they were the same. "She is there!" he cried. "Aunt Beatrice said she is there when the clock stops." Evelyn's shoes slipped on the mud. She caught herself against the thorny hedge and kept moving. "Your mother loved you. She would never ask you to come into danger. She left because of me." The words tore through the rain. Evelyn reached the base of the lighthouse as Samuel climbed the first broken steps inside. The old structure had not been lit in years. Its door hung crooked, and wind moved through it with a hollow sound. She followed him up the narrow spiral stair, the lantern throwing wild circles of light along the damp stone. Halfway up, Samuel stopped near a cracked window where the sea could be seen far below, white and furious beneath the cliff. He pressed the handkerchief to his face. "I want to tell her I am sorry." Evelyn knelt 2 steps below him, keeping her hands open, her body still. "Darling boy, you do not owe an apology for being born." He shook his head. "Father cannot look at me." Below them, the lighthouse door slammed in the wind, and a man's voice called through the dark. "Samuel." It was not the Duke's public voice. Not command. Not stone. It was a father's voice stripped bare. Samuel froze. Callum appeared at the foot of the stair, soaked through, his dark coat open, his face changed by fear so complete that it made him look younger and older at once. Oliver stood behind him in Mrs. Vale's coat, trembling but silent. "Do not come closer," Evelyn said softly, not because she feared Callum, but because Samuel did. The Duke stopped at once. That obedience mattered. Samuel looked down at him. "Did Mama die because of me?" Callum's hand closed over the railing. For 4 years, the house had answered that question with silence. Now the storm demanded words. "No," he said, and his voice broke on the single syllable. "No, Samuel. Never." The child stared at him, desperate and disbelieving. Callum climbed 1 step, then stopped again. "I failed you because I was afraid of my own grief. I looked away because I thought seeing pain would destroy me. But you were never the pain. You were her gift to me, and I have been a coward for making you feel like a wound." Samuel's face crumpled, not with terror now, but with the terrible relief of a child hearing the truth too late and still needing it. Evelyn reached out just enough for him to choose. He moved toward her, and she gathered him close as Callum came up the remaining steps. For a moment, the 3 of them knelt together in the trembling lantern light, rain hissing through the cracked window, the sea raging below. Callum's arms closed around his son first, then around the space that held Evelyn too, not possessive, not improper, but sheltering, as if his body had finally remembered what his heart had forgotten. Samuel whispered into his father's coat. "Father!" Callum bowed over him. "I am here." Oliver stood below, watching with both hands pressed to the railing, his lips parted as if he had witnessed a door open that he had believed sealed forever. When they returned to Ashbourne Hall, drenched and shaking, Mrs. Vale wept silently by the kitchen fire while towels and blankets were brought. Beatrice appeared on the stairs in her dressing gown, pale with outrage and alarm, but Callum looked at her with a coldness deeper than any winter. "You will leave my house at first light," he said. No one questioned him. No one needed to. Upstairs, Samuel fell asleep with one hand in his father's and the other in Evelyn's, the handkerchief resting open between them like a small white flag. And far below, in the silent east wing, the old clock gave one faint, impossible tick. At dawn, Lady Beatrice Wainwright left Ashbourne Hall in a white carriage that looked far less triumphant than it had upon arrival. No one stood beneath the archway to wave farewell. Mrs. Vale watched from an upper window with her mouth pressed thin. Oliver remained in Samuel's room, and Callum stood in the entrance hall with one hand resting on the newel post, his face unreadable, while the wheels carried his wife's sister down the cliff road toward Whitemoor. Evelyn observed from the shadow of the morning room, not because she wished to hide, but because she understood that some departures belonged to the family they had wounded. When the last sound of the carriage faded beneath the wind, Ashbourne Hall did not become peaceful. It became exposed. Without Beatrice's cold certainty filling the rooms, the silence underneath seemed even more fragile, as if the house had been stripped of a bandage and forced to face the wound beneath. Samuel slept late, exhausted by the night at the lighthouse. Oliver sat beside him, pretending to read, though he turned no pages. Callum remained in his study until nearly noon, not working, not writing, only sitting before a desk covered with unopened estate papers while the old clock in the east wing continued its hesitant ticking, one small sound at a time, like a heart relearning its duty. At last, he came to the nursery door. Evelyn was arranging the boys' books in order of difficulty when his shadow fell across the threshold. "Miss Carter," he said, "there is a room I should have opened years ago." She looked at him. His eyes were tired, but no longer sealed. "For the boys?" "For all of us." He led her down the upper corridor, past the portraits, past the window where fog had thinned to a pale silver sheet over the sea. Oliver emerged from Samuel's room and followed without being asked. A moment later, Samuel appeared too, wrapped in a blanket, his small hand gripping his brother's sleeve. They stopped before the locked schoolroom. The brass key still hung on its dusty ribbon beside the door. Callum lifted it with fingers that were steady only because he forced them to be. No one spoke as he placed the key in the lock. The sound was soft, but it seemed to move through the entire house. The door opened inward. Dust drifted in the gray light. The room smelled of closed books, cold ashes, and lavender faded almost beyond memory. Small desks stood near the window. A rocking chair rested by the fireplace. Shelves held readers, wooden blocks, and a little ship with one broken mast. On the far wall hung a portrait beneath a black veil. Samuel stepped closer to Evelyn. Oliver's face went pale with anger or grief, perhaps both. Callum stood motionless before the covered painting. "Her name was Amelia Rose Ashbourne," he said, "and I have allowed this house to remember her falsely." Evelyn did not interrupt. The boys did not breathe loudly enough to be heard. Callum reached for the veil, but his hand stopped inches away. "Your aunt loved her in the only way she understood, by turning her into something flawless. I helped her do it because a perfect memory cannot argue with a grieving man. But your mother was not a saint in a frame. She was warm, impatient, fond of bad piano music, and incapable of keeping flowers alive. She laughed when it was improper. She worried too much. She feared storms." Samuel whispered, "She did?" Callum looked at him, and this time he did not look away. "Yes. She would have hated last night." A faint, trembling breath left Samuel. Oliver stared at the veiled portrait. "Then why did you make her into someone we could never reach?" The question would have angered another father. It humbled this one. Callum lowered his head. "Because if I admitted she had been human, then I would have to admit she had truly died. I thought grief was loyalty. I was wrong." He drew the veil down. The woman in the painting was beautiful, yes, but not untouchable. Her smile was half-formed, as if she had been about to speak when the artist captured her. One hand rested over the curve of a cradle beside her. The other held a sprig of wild lavender. Samuel took one step forward. "She looks kind." "She was," Callum said. "And she loved you before she ever saw your face." His voice roughened, but he did not retreat from it. "The night she left us, she asked me to keep the house full of light. She asked me not to let love become a locked room." The words settled over them with the weight of years wasted. Evelyn felt tears rise, but kept them quiet. This was not her sorrow to own. It was hers only to witness. Samuel walked to the portrait, and touched the painted lavender with one fingertip. Oliver stood beside him, rigid at first, then slowly placed the broken wooden ship upright on the shelf. "Can this be our schoolroom again?" Oliver asked. Callum looked around at the dust, the cold hearth, the small chairs waiting like unanswered prayers. "If you wish it." Samuel turned to Evelyn. Will you teach us here? Before she could answer, Callum spoke, softer than before. Only if Miss Carter chooses. That mattered. The choice. The respect of it. Evelyn looked at the children, then at the man who had finally opened the door grief had guarded for 4 years. Then yes, she said. But the windows must be opened first. For the first time in that room, Oliver almost smiled. Callum crossed to the tall windows and lifted the latch. They resisted, swollen by years of damp and disuse, but then gave way. Cold sea air rushed in, carrying salt, gull cries, and the far sound of waves striking the cliffs. Dust stirred. Curtains breathed. The room, once sealed around death, took in the morning. Later, while Mrs. Vale brought pails, cloths, and a look of astonished relief, the 4 of them began the quiet labor of returning the schoolroom to life. Evelyn sorted books. Oliver repaired the little ship's mast with twine. Samuel placed his mother's handkerchief beneath the portrait, not like a shrine, but like a greeting. Callum knelt by the fireplace and laid kindling with hands that had signed fortunes, dismissed servants, and held sorrow too tightly for too long. Evelyn watched him strike the match. The flame caught slowly, then grew. Its light touched the portrait, the children's faces, the open window, and at last the Duke himself. He looked at Evelyn across the room, not with command, not with desperation, but with something more dangerous because it was gentler. Gratitude. Trust. The beginning of need. You were right, he said quietly, while the boys argued over where the atlas should go. About what, Your Grace? A home cannot be purchased. Evelyn held his gaze. No. The fire cracked softly between them. But it can be rebuilt, he said. And for the first time since she had entered Ashbourne Hall, Evelyn believed he was not speaking only of stone. For nearly 1 week after the schoolroom opened, Ashbourne Hall lived as if afraid to believe in its own awakening. The change was not grand. No ballroom blazed with music. No guests filled the corridors. No announcement appeared in the Widemore Gazette. Yet the house altered in small, undeniable ways. Curtains were drawn back before breakfast. The schoolroom fire was lit each morning. Oliver began leaving his maps on the table instead of hiding them in drawers. Samuel no longer carried his mother's handkerchief clenched in his fist, but folded it carefully beneath her portrait before lessons, as if memory could rest there without being guarded every second. Evelyn taught them fractions with apples, geography with shipping routes, and spelling with words they chose themselves. Oliver chose lighthouse. Samuel chose mother. Evelyn wrote both on the slate, and did not let her hand tremble. Callum came to the schoolroom more often now, sometimes with estate papers, sometimes with no excuse at all. He stood by the window while the boys worked and listened as Evelyn guided them not by command, but by faith that they wanted to learn. Once, when Samuel stumbled over a sentence, Callum moved as if to correct him, then stopped. Evelyn saw the restraint. So did Samuel. The boy finished the line alone, and his father's quiet pride filled the room more warmly than praise. But beyond the cliffs, the world had not softened. Lady Beatrice had departed Ashbourne Hall, yet her words travelled faster than her carriage. By Saturday, whispers had reached Whitemore. By Monday, Mrs. Vale returned from town with flour, lamp oil, and a face so stiff with anger that Evelyn knew before she spoke. They are saying things, miss? Evelyn set down the lesson books. About me? Mrs. Vale's lips pressed together. About you. About His Grace. About why a dismissed schoolteacher remains in a widower's house. Evelyn looked toward the window, where the Atlantic lay iron-gray beneath a low sky. She had known it would come. A woman without family was never allowed to stand near power without being accused of reaching for it. That evening at supper, Oliver asked why the baker's boy had laughed when the Ashbourne carriage passed. Samuel asked whether Miss Carter had done something wrong. Callum put down his fork, the silver striking the plate with a small, final sound. No. The word was controlled, but beneath it lay anger. Then why do they say she should leave? Samuel whispered. Evelyn's heart tightened. Callum looked at her across the table, and for one breath the room seemed to wait for a vow either of them had named. "Because people often fear what repairs what they wish to keep broken," he said. It was a beautiful defense. It was also private. The town would not hear it. The boys would still suffer from what others imagined. That night, Evelyn sat at the writing desk in the blue guest room while the lamp burned low and fog moved past the window like a pale hand searching the glass. Before her lay 3 sheets of paper. She wrote Oliver's name on the first, and paused a long time before the words came. She told him that intelligence was not coldness, that caution was not cowardice, and that ships were not made to remain forever in harbor. On Samuel's letter, her tears nearly fell, but she would not stain the page. She told him his mother's love did not lessen because another heart cared for him, and that he had never been a burden placed upon the earth by mistake. The final letter was for Callum. She began it 3 times. Your Grace. Duke Ashbourne. Callum. Each felt both too distant and too intimate. At last, she wrote simply that the boys deserved peace more than she deserved shelter, that scandal was a draught no child should be forced to sleep beside, and that he had already begun to return to them. That was enough. It had to be enough. Before dawn, Ashbourne Hall lay quiet beneath a sky the color of pewter. Evelyn, dressed in the plain grey gown Mrs. Vale had given her, folded the borrowed shawl at the foot of the bed, and packed only what she had brought: 2 books, $11, and the dignity she had nearly mistaken for belonging. In the schoolroom, she placed the boys' letters beside the atlas. She touched the edge of Duchess Amelia's portrait, not in farewell to the dead, but in apology to the living she was leaving behind. Downstairs, Mrs. Vale waited in the entrance hall, as if grief had woken her before footsteps did. "Miss Carter," she said, her voice low, "do not do this." Evelyn took the older woman's hands. "I am doing it before they are made ashamed of loving me." "They are not ashamed." "No. That is why I must leave before the world teaches them how." Mrs. Vale closed her eyes. The footman brought a small hired carriage to the side door, not the grand Ashbourne carriage that would draw attention. Evelyn stepped into the cold morning and did not look back until the wheels began to move. Then she saw the great grey house on the cliff, its windows faintly lit, the schoolroom among them. For one brief moment, she imagined Samuel waking and reaching for the book they had not finished. She imagined Oliver pretending not to care while his hands shook. She imagined Callum standing in the room she had emptied, understanding too late that some silences were departures. The carriage rolled down the road toward Whitemore. Behind her, the hall remained still for 10 more minutes. Then Oliver found the letters. His cry tore through the upper floor. Callum came running from his study, coat unbuttoned, face pale. Samuel stood beside the schoolroom table with Evelyn's letter pressed to his chest, too stunned to weep. Oliver held his own page in one hand and stared at his father with a fury made entirely of fear. "You let Mother die," he said, each word shaking. "Do not let Miss Carter disappear too." Callum stopped as if the sentence had struck the breath from him. No servant moved. No clock ticked. Even the sea seemed to pause beneath the cliff. Then Samuel whispered, "Please, Father." It was not the plea of a child asking for comfort. It was the plea of a son asking his father to finally choose the living. Callum looked at the empty chair by the schoolroom fire, at the open atlas, at the slate where Samuel's words still remained in chalk. Mother. Not replacement. Not scandal. Not charity. Home. He turned at once. "Harness the carriage," he said. Mrs. Vale was already at the door with his coat in her hands. This time, Callum did not hesitate outside the room. He crossed it, knelt before both boys, and took their trembling hands in his. "I should have gone after what mattered long before today," he said. "But I am going now." Oliver's mouth tightened, but his eyes shone. Samuel nodded once. Within minutes the black Ashbourne carriage thundered down the cliff road toward Whitemore, its silver crest bright against the morning fog. Inside, Callum held Evelyn's letter open in his gloved hand, reading the final line again and again until the words ceased to be farewell and became a command his heart could no longer disobey. You have already begun to return to them. Do not stop now. The Ashbourne carriage reached Whitemoor just as the town bell struck 9, its sound carrying over wet rooftops, shuttered shopfronts, and the narrow street where gossip had already begun its morning work. Evelyn Carter stood before the entrance of Miss Halloway's Academy for Young Ladies, her valise at her feet and her gloved hands folded around the last of her composure. The headmistress, a severe woman with silver spectacles and a mouth made for refusal, held Evelyn's papers as if they might soil her fingers. I do not question your learning, Miss Carter, she said, which meant that she questioned everything else. But parents are cautious. A teacher's reputation must be as spotless as her penmanship. Evelyn had expected the words. Still, they found their way beneath her coat and settled there like cold rain. I understand, she replied. Do you? The headmistress lowered her voice, though two mothers in the hall leaned closer to hear. A dismissed schoolteacher residing in a widower's private estate is not a small matter. Whitemoor may be provincial, but it is not blind. Evelyn lifted her chin. The floorboards smelled of chalk dust and lemon polish. Through an open classroom door she saw 12 little girls bent over copybooks, their ribbons bright, their futures guarded by people who would never forgive a poor woman for needing shelter. Then Whitemoor should improve its sight, she said quietly, because it has mistaken mercy for scandal. A murmur passed through the hall. The headmistress stiffened. That will be all, Miss Carter. Evelyn took back her papers with steady hands. She had lost another door. It would not be the first. It might not be the last. She reached for her valise, but before her fingers touched the handle, the sound of carriage wheels stopped every whisper in the building. Not the light wheels of a hired cab. The deep, certain arrival of wealth that had never needed permission to be heard. The front door opened. Cold morning air swept inside, carrying the smell of fog, horses, and the sea. Duke Callum Ashbourne entered with Oliver on one side and Samuel on the other. He wore no hat. His dark coat was damp from the mist. His face held the grave stillness Whitemoor knew and feared, yet his eyes searched only for Evelyn. Samuel broke first. He ran across the hall and wrapped both arms around her waist, pressing his face into her coat with the desperate trust of a child who had lost enough to know what return meant. Oliver followed more slowly, trying to preserve dignity, and failing beautifully when his hand found hers and held on. The mother stared. The headmistress went pale. Evelyn could not speak. Callum stopped before her, but he did not take her hand from the boy's. He looked at the room instead, at every lifted chin, every sharpened glance, every person who had weighed Evelyn's worth by the poverty of her position and found it convenient to doubt her. When he spoke, his voice was quiet enough to command more attention than shouting ever could. This woman entered my house in a storm with nothing to recommend her but courage. She did not seek my title. She did not ask for my fortune. She taught my sons to read again, to sleep again, to speak what grief had taught them to bury. She opened rooms I had allowed sorrow to lock. She did more for Ashbourne Hall in a few weeks than all my wealth did in 4 years. The headmistress swallowed. Your Grace, the concern was only for propriety. Propriety, Callum said, is often the name people give to cruelty when they wish it to sound respectable. A silence fell so complete that even the classroom beyond seemed to stop breathing. Evelyn looked at him then, truly looked, and saw that the man who had once offered shelter like a bargain had come to give honor like a vow. He turned back to her, and the severity left his face. Miss Carter, he said, and his voice softened around her name. I cannot undo the morning you were left on the road. I cannot erase the words spoken against you. I cannot return the years my sons spent waiting for their father to become brave. Samuel tightened his arms around her. Oliver's hand trembled in hers. Callum lowered himself to one knee on the polished schoolhouse floor, not as a duke performing romance for witnesses, but as a man laying down pride where love required humility. But I can ask you to come home, not as charity, not as convenience, and not as a shadow beneath another woman's memory. Come home as the woman my sons trust, the woman this house needs, and the woman I have come to love with the part of my heart I believed had died." Evelyn's breath caught. Around them, Whitemore vanished. There was only the man kneeling before her, the boys holding fast to her, and the impossible warmth of belonging after so long in the cold. "Your Grace?" she whispered, because it was the only title her stunned heart could find. Callum's eyes lifted to hers. "Callum, if you can forgive me for taking so long." A tear slipped free despite her dignity, and this time she did not hide it. "Only if you forgive me for leaving." "No," Oliver said at once, fierce and young. "No one is leaving." Samuel looked up at Evelyn with solemn hope. "Please!" That single word finished what pride had tried to protect. Evelyn placed her free hand in Callum's. "Then let us go home." By the time the carriage returned to Stormhaven Cliffs, the fog had lifted from Ashbourne Hall. Mrs. Vale stood waiting beneath the archway, weeping openly into a handkerchief she no longer pretended to need for dust. The great front doors opened not into a tomb, but into a house listening for footsteps. In the weeks that followed, the schoolroom became the brightest chamber in the east wing. Oliver's maps covered the walls. Samuel read the Harbor Mice aloud by the fire without stopping at the sad pages. Duchess Amelia's portrait remained uncovered, not as a rival to the living, but as a beloved part of the family's true history. The old lighthouse was repaired the following spring, and on the first evening its lamp shone across the Atlantic. Callum stood with Evelyn and the boys on the cliff path while the beam moved over the dark water, steady and patient, reaching farther than any of them expected. The clock in the east wing no longer stopped at 2:17. It passed the hour softly each night, as if grief itself had learned to keep moving. And Ashbourne Hall, once filled with locked rooms and unfinished goodbyes, became what Evelyn had always known a home must be, not shelter bought with money, not duty arranged by fear, but a place where wounded hearts were allowed to stay, heal, and be loved without having to earn the right to belong.